The Rundown with Carrie Saldo podcast is funded by Armbrook Village, offering research-based arts, music, fitness, and lifelong learning programs at their assisted living and Alzheimer's care community in Westfield. armbrookvillage.com.
This is The Rundown, your weekly news and review from Western Mass. I'm Carrie Saldo. Good morning and welcome to our show this Friday, April 12th. Some points to ponder about the recent news from the 413. The New Yorker put national spotlight on a controversy at Amherst Middle School last week, and I'm confronting my cisgender and white privilege in an entirely new way. Magic mushrooms might be on the ballot come November, and the IRS is issuing fewer refunds. Just what you want to hear with tax day coming, right? We'll get to all of that and more in today's show. But first, let me introduce our panel. Rob Rizzuto, the Public Information Officer for the Hampden County Sheriff's Office, Dave Eisenstatter, Managing Producer at Mass Live, and Nirvani Williams, a reporter here at NEPM. Good morning, everyone.
Hello.
Good morning.
Before I get to the latest news about another lawsuit filed against Amherst Pelham Regional School District, I'm going to ask Dave Eisenstatter to give us context on how we got here. Dave, Mass Live reported on this controversy at Amherst Middle School over the mistreatment of transgendered students and subsequent allegations of racism, lawsuits, and more. And you did much of the early reporting on this stemming back to last May. Can you help us get some context for what's transpired?
Sure. There's a lot that's been going on. A lot of this came to a head a year ago, came to kind of public light, but it had been going on for years beforehand. There were a group of LGBT students who were experiencing a lot of bullying in the middle school and had been going to their parents, had in some cases had to leave the school. And it got to the point where one of the parents of one of the students had filed a Title IX report against the district, which is a federal law surrounding discrimination on the basis of gender. So this had been going on, and actually the student newspaper at the high school really were the first ones to really shine a big light on this. They had a big expose talking to a lot of the students involved, trying to reach out to guidance counselors who the students had tried to go to but had experienced what they felt was mistreatment at their hands. So the student journalists had this big report that came out last year in May, and a lot of things happened very quickly after that. The superintendent had took a medical leave, leaving kind of a vacancy at the top. And a lot of the guidance counselors who were implicated in the report were placed on leave. While all these reports are going on, sorry if this is complex, and if anyone wants to jump in with a question,
you're doing great.
Happy to explain. But basically, after that, another superintendent was appointed, and a assistant superintendent who had been responsible for a lot of the hiring practices in the district that had hired these counselors that the students had said were the source of the problem. She was placed on leave. In kind of the after effects of everything, the teachers union had called for her resignation, for the assistant superintendent's resignation, and kind of in the aftermath of everything, a lot of school committee members had resigned over this.
And I think there's one more piece I do want to ask you about,
Yep.
And this is a very layered and very complicated story. As I understand it, there were also some administrative people, especially people of color, who came forward and said, while these children who are saying they're trans and they're being bullied, we feel like we have been racially discriminated against. Didn't that happen as well?
Well, going back many years, but at least a decade, there have been issues at the Amherst schools over allegations of racism within the schools, directed at staff members. One of the controversies had resulted in the previous superintendent, before all this happened, events that led to her stepping down. So one of the really big pushes in the district had been to diversify the staff, hire more teachers of color. Amherst, I think a lot of people think about Amherst as a mostly white community, which is true, but the schools themselves, I believe, are about half students of color, and the staff had not been reflecting that. So there had been a big push to hire this superintendent with a mission to help hire more staff of color. And those hiring practices had led to a lot of friction, and the underlying issue of structural racism that a lot of the staff members at Amherst schools said that they had experienced, that didn't go away. And I think that's one of the things that led to this lawsuit that we're going to talk about.
Yes, and your colleague Juliet Schulman Hall wrote for Mass Live about this latest lawsuit, which was filed against the regional school district. This time, it's the current dean of students, Lamiko McGee, is accusing the district and administrators of defamation and violating civil rights laws and harassment, among other claims. What is this suit that she endured, Dave?
So she was the president of the union during last year when a lot of the controversy was unfolding, and she's a black woman, and is actually one of the finalists to be principal at the middle school where all of these events had taken place. She had applied for that position before, hadn't become a finalist. What she has claimed is that she had engaged in protected activity as a union leader, as a woman of color, and also bringing up issues about structural racism that she saw and that she was retaliated against. That at least in one case that she was asked to step down, was let go, but then was reinstated. She claims a lot of these practices had been retaliatory for that protected behavior that she had done before.
And this latest lawsuit comes as national and even international spotlight hopped onto Amherst last week. The New Yorker magazine published a lengthy piece, largely backstory on the issue as it had transpired over the past year. And then that reporting was essentially digested and sort of regurgitated by the Daily Mail UK. So there's that international spotlight. Jessica Winter from the New Yorker piece didn't tell anyone locally anything new, I don't think necessarily, but she did bring this situation to a national audience, and she described it this way, quote, "A collision of multiple issues, racial tension, union power, and the respectful treatment of queer and trans kids, and the place of religion in schools. So some of the biggest, most complicated, hot-button issues of our time swirling in one place at the same exact time." Given the increased exposure we're seeing here, Nirvani, to an already fraught situation, I've been thinking about the impact it's having on students and staff and teachers who are still at Amherst School, going there every day. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to remind the audience that there are still students and teachers and administrators at the center of this massive story, and that especially students and teachers are probably feeling pretty traumatized and confused. And I think it's important that administrators create an outlet for staff and themselves to express their feelings and thoughts on this. I wonder if the school district is doing that, because it is still fully functioning, and I think it's hard to I think it's hard to mention and center the fact that these students are also going through this in real time, given the scope of the story.
Yeah, and
yeah, I think that this latest issue is a microcosm of the greater issue in the Amherst community. As Dave mentioned, these issues go back, well over a decade. It's been, I hate to say it, but one thing after another, in the school district, and in Amherst as a whole. I know of, several black UMass students who have spoken about how they feel on campus and their treatment. And I know there's been some great reporting from the Collegian up there over the years, excuse me, about the issues of race and really how people feel in that space up there. And, I think the New Yorker really pointed a good light on it. When people think of Amherst, they think of this progressive, happy, positive community, but sometimes the actions and the attitudes don't match the words.
Yeah,
people are saying the right things, but, how are they acting? How are they doing?
And that's one of the things that the author, Jessica Winters, I think, hit on, that this conflict has come to feel irresolvable. And she said, quote, "Here, as in so many pockets of America these days, conflict doesn't seem to be part of a difficult journey toward resolution. Rather, conflict often appears to be the entire point." And, I know this is the rundown and not media criticism 413, but that statement to me feels like the author's attempt to help this piece apply to a national audience, right? The trans students who spoke out, their families, the people of color who have come forward, all crying out for change around this issue, that to me feels very much like a difficult journey toward, if not resolution, as Winter said, but certainly a difficult journey toward something other than what has happened so far here. And when this controversy, this is me speaking personally here, hit last May, and I'll own this, I've kept sort of a comfortable distance from it because I've been waiting for that resolution before weighing in. And because this is such a complicated issue, that distance is coming from my place, right? My privilege as a white person, as a cisgendered person. And I'm here to say clearly that this show is not here to wait for a resolution, right? We are here to help discuss and debate and think these things through. And it's hard and we're not always going to get it right. But I think we're going to keep trying and learning together. And I definitely invite our listeners and other folks to join us in that process. Okay. Rob, I mentioned earlier that the New Yorker piece and the Daily Mail Online picked this up. Those two publications, I think, are about as far apart ideologically as you can possibly get. All Sides Media points out that the New Yorker is far left and the Daily Mail is far right. The New Yorker dubbed this situation, quote, "a meltdown at a middle school in a liberal town." And the Daily Mail said, quote, "it's a toxic identity politics war." I know you're currently with the sheriff's office, but you covered politics for a long time at Mass Live. What do you think about these two very different publications taking this up?
Well, I think that just like any other, happening or good piece of news, there's always a way to spin it for political interests. The truth is not as powerful as perception. And once you work off the basis of perception, particularly to your own audience, people spin things. That's just the nature of it. But one thing that really stood out to me with all the reporting that I thought, hit the nail on the head, it was, and this is a paraphrase of a direct quote from an Amherst resident in the New Yorker article. They said, "What you're seeing here is the left eating its own. This is happening across the country, and it's not exclusive to Amherst." And I think that division within a group of perhaps ideologically minded people that, believe in some of the same tenets, going after each other. Somebody's not black enough. A gay person is not, enough into, transgender rights. These differentiations, I think, that people draw amongst each other do more harm than good when it comes to attacking the real issues. Some of the fundamental issues that haven't changed as much as they should have over the past 200 years in the United States. For me, that really kind of crystallized it because politically speaking, I see it all the time. People attacking people that are perhaps on their own side or perhaps aren't that different from themselves, but they're not good enough for their idealism. I think the whole idea for a lot of people, there's this existential idealism that is very, very comfortable. They love to revel in it. But when you really get down to the ground level of it, do they want to be next to these people that they say they're advocating for? Do they want to be on their same team? Do they want to be in the same car as them? And I think, unfortunately, what you find a lot of the time is no.
Yeah, I think sort of some of that resolution you said you have been waiting for, it's just interesting because I think that there is some of that conflict, but I think, the hope is that some people are coming to some understanding about this. I was talking to Lamika McGee recently, and I asked her about this issue about, people of color versus LGBT, is that how you see this? Or, do you think that the focus on these LGBT issues is taking light away from the racism issues that you say you've experienced? And she got pretty emotional in her response. She was saying that, this focus on these LGBT students was so important because you look at the suicide rates among these students, and it's really devastating. And so she was really hopeful that that there was going to be attention paid to all of the issues, all the experiences of people. And some of these people are overlapping. There are people of color who are also identify as LGBTQ. So there are people who are experiencing all sides of this issue. I think some of the implication in the New Yorker piece, or maybe just the idea behind the New Yorker piece, is that a place like Amherst, which is, I think they claimed voted 90% for Biden, was a liberal place, should have these issues figured out. But they really, I don't think that Amherst has racism figured out any more so than any other community in America.
Well, certainly this issue is one that we will keep watching here on The Rundown. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back to talk about history being made in Springfield, magic mushrooms, and tax day, and more. This is Carrie Saldo and The Rundown. Welcome back to The Rundown. I'm Carrie Saldo, in studio this week dissecting the week's news with Rob Rizzuto, Dave Eisenstatter, and Nirvani Williams. Let's look at history in the making in Springfield, shall we? As the third largest city in our state and the fourth largest city in New England swore in its very first black police superintendent, Lawrence Akers. His wife, Mary Akers, gave an impassioned speech at the ceremony on Wednesday. Here's part of what she said.
But make no mistake, Lawrence Akers is not being named superintendent of police because he is a black man. He is being named superintendent of police despite being a black man. And that is all we marginalized people ask. And that is the space in which we truly celebrate today.
In her speech, Mary Akers also said that this promotion was not on their family vision board. He was close to retirement age. Dave, Akers could have said, I am close to retirement age. I've got 40 years on the job here. I'm out. What do you think it says about him that he wants to lead this department, which is currently embattled and embroiled in a number of scandals?
Yeah, I mean, wow. I think it's very impressive to take on a challenge like that. The Springfield Police Department has so many trust issues with the community. Springfield itself experienced a record number of homicides last year. Some of the experts that we spoke to over the course of reporting that said that trust with the police department could be a major reason why that leads to this high homicide number. So it's a big job running the Springfield Police Department. And there's actually a home rule petition to allow him to continue in that role, because I believe he's turning 65 soon. He'd have to step down in later this year, but he'd get an extra 5 years through the home rule petition. So it's a big job, and it's an impressive just job ahead of him to have to do that.
Yeah, and Akers, in his remarks to the crowd, said that he knows that there's work to be done regarding public trust, given the allegations of misconduct and wrongdoing facing the department in recent years. Here's a bit more of what he said.
I want our residents to feel comfortable and confident that they can come to me or any other member of this department and get the help and answers they seek and be treated with professionalism and respect. I'm also hoping that the public will look at our department differently and not have the negative feelings that some do. All I ask is patience and a chance.
Patience and a chance. Nirvani, given that negative perception that he referenced and that some do hold about the department, do you think that Springfield residents who already have a strong distrust for the department will give some patience and a chance with Akers at the helm?
I think it's interesting. I reported on the consent decree status hearing that took place in January, and there were some residents who were there, and they said that they really wanted more transparency from the department, and especially with a consent decree, on the department already, there's a lot of mistrust in the community. I think they want to see a lot more changes, and they're not sure that's going to happen with Akers at the helm. There were a few community, nonprofit leaders at the consent decree status hearing as well, and they said that they really wanted a national search to find the best person to take on the job, but that didn't happen, so they're pretty skeptical now. And I guess we'll just have to wait and see what he does.
Rob, you work with Hampden County Sheriff's Office, obviously very close ties with law enforcement across the county. What have you been hearing about Larry Akers taking the superintendent's role there in Springfield?
So, previous to my time with the Sheriff's Office, I was an assistant managing editor at the Republican and Mass Live. So my heart is in journalism, and I'm always skeptical.
Recovering journalist.
Yes. But everybody I spoke with about Larry Akers has said that he's a genuinely good person who is interested in doing the right thing. People that I spoke with that advocated for him, I trust implicitly. Because, like I said, I approach everything with a touch of skepticism. Institutionally, I think the Springfield Police Department has a lot of history within itself to overcome. They have to make changes that aren't just made on policy, but they're made in attitude. They're reflected in hiring. They're reflected in on-the-job training. And they're eventually reflected in the way everybody interacts with the members of the public. I think that over the past couple of years, there has been a lot of positive changes. It might not be at the pace or to the breadth that some people are looking for. But realistically speaking, I know that, retired Superintendent Cheryl Clapper took on that job. Again, she did not have to. She could have retired happily and not had the headache.
She had 40 years in the department, too.
Absolutely. She could have walked, been very happy, enjoyed her time. She took on the challenge, and she made some very tough calls that were not popular within the police department, but they were very necessary in the greater scheme of things. Earned back a lot of the public trust. And from my understanding, Larry Akers has that same dedication. He's willing to be the bad guy internally to do the right thing in the bigger scheme of things.
Yeah, and Dave mentioned this already, but he is going to be turning 65, so that home rule petition was required to give him another 5 years. The city has already done its part to cut the red tape. The state has not yet finalized this process, so it was interesting to me to see the city of Springfield instating him ahead of that. Do you think that pushes the legislature to get this done, or is it going to tick legislators off because it's essentially telling them what to do?
Well, it has the power to do either, but I think in this specific case, it has the power to move things forward. I was in that room for Larry Akers swearing in, and it was powerful. So while I understand that some people might think, he's part of the establishment, he's part of the process. If you were in there and you heard his words, looked into his eyes, and really felt the power of what that moment represented in a city as big as Springfield with all the sordid history, I think that the legislature is going to step up and get this taken care of.
Well, we will certainly see. Nirvani, let's turn to some reporting from you. Recently, a special joint committee of the Massachusetts legislature is considering asking voters in November whether to legalize access to some psychedelic drugs. What's the latest on this, Nirvani?
So, the special joint committee of the Massachusetts legislature is investigating if they should pose this question to voters. And they heard testimony a few weeks ago at a hearing. And Matt, for magic mushrooms to legalize this substance. And I find this so fascinating and interesting because there's so much research that's come out about how impactful this can be for people who are going through depression and PTSD. There were a lot of medical experts who presented at the hearing, and one doctor at Mass General Hospital and an instructor at Harvard Medical School said that the criminalization of psychedelics impedes scientific progress and also, quote, denies individuals access to potentially life-changing treatments. And it was just fascinating kind of seeing that and hearing that. And then there were a bunch of people who spoke at the hearing as well, during the public comment section, and everyone who spoke was a proponent of this as a therapeutic
Really, no
substance.
opposition spoken
No.
which is
No.
shocking given the rap that magic mushrooms have as this sort of pleasure device, and then the lifestyle that surrounds it, and all of the negative connotations. No one spoke against it. That's it. I'm sure there are plenty of people opposed who will come out of the woodwork if this ends up on the ballot.
Yes, absolutely. The opposition was that this isn't FDA approved. Psilocybin, which is the
Active ingredient there.
active ingredient there. Yeah.
But certainly several Massachusetts communities, including Cambridge, Somerville, Salem, and familiar to all of us, Northampton, have passed ordinances on decriminalizing possession of psychedelics. What do you think is behind this blooming support?
Well, I think if you look at what is FDA approved, lots of opiates. And I think it really took, the opioid crisis for people to open their eyes and realize that just because the government tells you something is okay doesn't necessarily mean that it is, particularly when it comes to medicine. It took the opioid crisis going to every corner of America and destroying families and communities for people to realize, well, maybe the way that we're approaching things is not working. And that's where you saw a more openness to marijuana legalization and people not going toward traditional mood and behavior altering drugs and finding ways to take care of themselves with THC and marijuana. I know people that have been, there's one particular individual I know, his father had a terrible health incident. He had 5 kids of his own to take care of. Then the father eventually passed. He fell into a deep depression. Nothing was working for him, but he knew he had to get his act together. He had 5 kids to support on his own. He did his own research, and he grew his own mushrooms and started microdosing. And the microdosing with the psilocybin actually changed him in such a positive way. Not only did he pull himself out of the funk of the depression, but he was actually able to get to a level where his previous anxiety was no longer dominating his life and his thoughts and his actions. And I'd say that at this point, he's a much more rounded out and evolved individual. So why not let people explore these different alternatives instead of saying, well, we have to trust the federal government and the FDA to dictate to us what we can take and what we can do to make ourselves better.
It's interesting how just in government approval of certain drugs, psilocybin and other psychedelics are in a classification that that currently says they have no medical use whatsoever, when there's so much research now that shows that it really can have a positive effect. One thing that struck me was the commission that looks at decertifying police officers in the state now, the Post Commission. One of the officers that I believe was decertified, the reason behind that was for trying a psychedelic as part of a trauma healing process through being a police officer. So trying to deal with the trauma of being a police officer, gets you decertified. And I think that it's interesting that the state is looking at legalization in this area.
Certainly lots of research out there now about the positive benefits, the positive effects potentially of using mushrooms on PTSD and that type of related treatment, depression, so many other things. Nirvani, where does this issue go from here?
Well, now it's really up to the special committee to take in all of these testimonies, go through it, and then make a decision of whether or not to let this bill go through, to pose the question to voters in November. So they're kind of in the process of that right now.
We'll keep watching this and other potential ballot questions here on The Rundown. Dave, I'm going to turn to you. Recent reporting for you, Dave Eidensetter and Mass Live. Very timely reporting, given the fact that tax day is approaching. The headline here, IRS on track to give fewest refunds in at least 15 years, records show. What got you thinking about this topic, Dave?
Well, have you done your taxes yet?
We're on extension.
Okay. Tax day is a big news topic, and I'm on irs.gov pretty regularly looking at updates and such. One of the things that just caught my attention was that there were fewer returns being filed for a while because tax season started about a week later this year for various reasons. So there were fewer returns coming in, but there were many, many fewer refunds being given. And just this discrepancy was interesting. I decided to just ask for records going back, and from a period of 2009 through just a few years ago, between 70 and 80% of people who were filing returns were getting refunds. Now it's creeping down to the mid 60s and even lower. So that was just interesting. So there are a few. I got little help on why this might be.
I was just going to say, do we know what's causing this drop in refunds?
Yeah, most of what I had heard was speculation. There was some idea that maybe people are taking more out of their paychecks in advance, and then they don't get the big refund at the end of the year. As with so many things, the pandemic may have had some effect, given that so many people were given cash that then counted towards their refund later. So there wasn't a lot of really great answers about why this might be, but it's a really interesting trend, and interested to hear if people got refunds this year.
The least favorite answer for a reporter is not a whole lot of clarity there. So that's really unsatisfying, but really fascinating reporting. A bit of a bummer ahead of tax day. But perhaps the silver lining this year, Massachusetts residents do get a couple of extra days to file taxes or request extension like me, because the Patriots Day holiday is on Monday. So April 17th is tax day instead of April 15th. Right? I want to thank our panel this morning. It was a robust and difficult conversation, and I appreciate your insights and your patience and your thoughts on these topics. Thanks to Rob Rizzuto with the Hampden County Sheriff's Office, Steve Eisensider of Mass Live, and Nirvani Williams of NEPM. When we come back, news stories of the week that you might have missed from the NEPM newsroom. This is The Rundown. I'm Carrie Saldo. Happy birthday, Mom! Welcome back to The Rundown. I'm Carrie Saldo. Here's a look at some reporting highlights from the NEPM newsroom this week. A new poll of Massachusetts residents has President Joe Biden with a comfortable lead in his re-election bid. 44% of those surveyed said they would vote for the Democrat, 26% for Republican and former President Donald Trump, and 7% for independent Robert F. Kennedy Jr. But Trump is seeing positive numbers in some parts of the state. The poll was sponsored by GBH News and the Commonwealth Beacon and conducted by Mass Inc. Steve Kozzela, president of the Mass Inc. polling group, tells NEPM's Adam Frenier the trends regionally are familiar ones.
If you think back to almost any election recently, you've got a lot of blue around Boston, a lot of blue in the western part of the state, and then kind of a sea of red in between that, with a couple blue islands floating in it. So you're thinking, Springfield, Framingham, et cetera, some of the gateway cities you've got looking blue, and then a lot of red in the middle. And that really is the regionality that we're seeing when we look at the west and central regions in this survey.
Independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. only checked in at 7% in this poll, but he's in the low double figures in western and central Mass. Can he have much of an impact in this race?
I think that he can have an impact in the race, and there's a couple ways of looking at it. First of all, I think when you look at how independents have done historically, one note of caution is that they often poll better at this point in the race than where they end up. So, we think back to 2016 and we had, the Bill Weld, Gary Johnson campaign. They were polling in a similar range earlier on in the campaign, 8 to 10, 11%, that kind of range, and ended up under 3.5%. So it's not to say it will happen, but certainly there is historical precedent for independents polling better earlier on in the race than where they end up. Particularly among young voters, if Kennedy does have staying power, that's where the impact could really be felt. Young voters are very often a strong Democratic constituency, and to see, that Kennedy's doing the best among young voters has to be of concern to the Biden camp.
And what about the level of tension surrounding this race? I know you asked a number of questions about that. Was there a particular regional trend you picked up on?
Biggest thing is that the level of tension is very, very high, and it's very, very high pretty much everywhere. We did break it out by region and found that in the western part of the state, 75% say that they think either very bad or a crisis describes the level of political tension in America today. We also asked whether or not people think violence is likely, major violence in relation to the election. There, in the central region, we found 62% saying very or somewhat likely. Similar range, 68% in the western region saying they think violence is very or somewhat likely. I think what's notable really is that there isn't a ton of regional variation. People are just worried everywhere. who's going to win and who's going to vote for whom is part of it. But I think how do we get through this election in a way that avoids this kind of violence is one of the key questions that voters are really considering right now.
Let's shift gears to state politics for a second. There's one potential ballot question which could give the auditor's office the ability to audit the legislature. More than half of those responding said they would vote yes, just 12% no, but 35% didn't know or didn't answer. Does that last number indicate that this isn't a big deal to a good number of folks?
Well, it indicates that there's a long way to go in this, and a lot of people haven't made up their mind. And in ballot questions, often what happens is those people end up voting no on the ballot question. And the basic reason for that is that no on a ballot question preserves the status quo. You know, the questions are basically formatted as yes, do you want to change something? Or no, do you want to keep everything the same? So it stands to reason that if you don't really understand what the thing is or don't know a whole lot about it, then no is a natural place to go. If you're the yes side, you'll be pretty happy with, what is currently a huge lead. But also, I think perhaps a bit nervous about where that percentage stands. You'd certainly want it to be higher than that at this point, just because ballot questions tend to see their support decrease as election day approaches. That's when the no side really kicks into gear, when ads start to be run, when voters start tuning in. So 53% isn't as strong of a position as perhaps you'd want to start in.
That was Steve Gazella of Mass Inc. Polling Group talking with NEPM's Adam Frenier. The New England Farm Workers Council owes the government about $1 million. The social services organization was founded more than 50 years ago and was led for decades by Springfield civic leader Heriberto Flores. The council administered Hampden County's heating assistance program until a few years ago. Auditors found the organization misused about $1.9 million and has paid back about half of that amount. That's according to Jim Kinney of the Springfield Republican newspaper, who spoke this week with NEPM's Carrie Healy. Kinney's reporting tells the story of a rapid operational downshift at the New England Farm Workers Council.
Well, now they're basically down to the core function of working with migrant farm workers, which was what they did in the beginning. And now they're down to a very small core of people doing that under a federal grant. But at one point, it was a much larger 300-person organization that did all sorts of things. They no longer have a lot of the programs that they used to offer. If you go past their offices on Main Street, it's pretty evident. There are signs in the window telling people who are looking for youth pre-employment training or high school equivalency programs to go elsewhere, and there's references to other places one can go. The Latino Economic Development Corporation is operating from space in a farm workers building. And the farm workers also invested heavily in commercial real estate and housing real estate in Springfield, Holyoke, and elsewhere.
So a couple of years back, when the Farm Workers Council was administering that program for Hampden County, the LIHEAP program, meaning they were the organization where eligible households would turn to get help for paying for their winter heating, the nonprofit mixed nearly $2 million of state funds, the LIHEAP money, with their own operational funds. What happened there?
That's what the auditor's report said, and that's what the current president confirmed for me on the phone. The money was commingled and was used to prop up the organization because they had bills to pay, mostly from the underperforming real estate investments. And that meant that when September 2022 rolled around and it was time to close out the contract with the state and federal government for LIHEAP, they couldn't close out the account because there was $1.8 million in money that needed to be repaid, and they couldn't.
We should say that LIHEAP fuel assistance is now administered by the Valley Opportunity Council, and the farm workers group has to pay the money back to the state. So how is that going? They're, selling off properties to pay back the state?
Yes. The debt was $1.8 million in change. The executive director told me that they've paid in about half of it. The state confirmed that. The state's collecting the money on behalf of the federal government. It needs to go back to the feds. There's about $1 million outstanding, and they've been paying it by selling real estate, including a building in Bridgeport and stuff in Holyoke and here in Springfield, including one on Hamden Street near the radio station.
There have been a lot of investments made in some of this infrastructure that you're describing over the years from both state and federal funds. What happens when these properties are sold?
Well, right now, with the mortgage in place, the state is in position as a creditor, and they will be paid when the properties are sold. Like if you have a mortgage on your house and you sell it, you have to pay off that mortgage with the proceeds. That's what the document's purpose was, to guarantee that as the farm workers sell off the property, that the state will get the money.
You know, it's a tough time of year to do this. Isn't it sort of rule of thumb that interest rates have profound impacts on the value of income producing real estate? Is this selling thing going well for them? Are they on track to amass the money on some schedule?
It's going slower than expected because of the interest rate issue and its effect on interest rates. But I was told that one property, there's people looking at it this week. Major frustrating thing, especially for me, is that the redevelopment of the Paramount and Massasoit Hotel is stalled. And I keep being told that eventually there'll be a deal to get that property repaired and reopened. It's very frustrating to all of us who live and work in downtown Springfield because it's a beautiful old building that's sitting there decaying.
Remembering back to many rock concerts attended in the 90s at the Paramount, there is a mighty real estate portfolio that they do hold, and that includes that theater with historic origins. Also, down the street, the Student Prince and the Fort. What's the status there?
There is another plan in place to redevelop that building, probably involving Peter Picknelly, who's part of the investment group that saved the Fort, the restaurant. And the ultimate goal will be some sort of housing on the upper floors, which haven't been touched in forever.
That's reporter Jim Kinney from the Republican newspaper speaking to NEPM's Carrie Healy. And we should note here the Farm Workers Council previously supported some NEPM internships. The results of the 2024 World Happiness Survey are in, and our commentator, Robert Chipkin, is predictably not too happy. But actually, he admits he's not entirely unhappy either.
The findings, compiled by the United Nations, glumly reported that for the first time since the data was gathered, the United States has dropped out of the top 20 happiest countries and is now well behind number 1, Finland, and trailing even up-and-coming Lithuania. Especially ironic, as that is exactly the country my ancestors fled from a century ago in search of a happier life in America, one step ahead of the advancing Russian army. The researchers asked respondents to envision their lives on a ladder and to rate themselves at the top rung, 10, down to a lowly 1. Along with the grim task of wading through the massive report detailing why the denizens of 20 other countries would rather stay put, I took no joy in the self-evident finding that we're still well ahead of Afghanistan. That's the unhappy news. Now for the other news. It appears that my collection of cranky knees, stiff joints, and loaded calendar of doctor appointments is nothing compared to the soaring rents, unpaid college loans, and COVID-imposed isolation of 20-somethings, who I simply assumed were running marathons, getting high, and having sex galore, while I was just trying to get out of my chair. The biggest drop in reported happiness in the U.S. came from Americans under 30, who now have earned the garland of most bummed-out generation ever. Who knew that all the time I was searching for happiness by wanting to be 20 again, I should have been empathetic to the chorus of actual 20-year-olds saying, "Be careful what you wish for, Gramps." Part of the problem, said Eric Weiner, a so-called happiness expert, is that Americans have a huge expectation of happiness, and that by the time we advance into decrepitude, we simply know better. Which I admit is a small consolation, but still it's a reminder, as if I needed one, that practically everything I feared was true turns out to be absolutely wrong. And that, in its way, makes me happy.
Commentator Robert Chipkin happily lives and writes in Springfield. And that's our show for this week. The Rundown theme is courtesy of the Love Crumbs. Our director is Tony Dunn. Our board op is Phil Bishop. Our engineers are Betsy Langto, Kara Foster, Bart Rinkin, and Chuck Dubé. Production support and digital is courtesy of Ayu Suryawan. I'm Carrie Saldo. Please join me again here next week for The Rundown on 88.5 NEPM.